Out of all of the projects that Raphael was involved in during the last years of his life, including the vast number of movable paintings that we haven't even touched on yet, unquestionably, one of his greatest passions was architecture. This might seem astounding for many reasons, not least of which because these days, architecture and painting are completely non-overlapping activities. But in Renaissance Italy, things were quite different. Filippo Brunelleschi, who famously found a way to design and build the dome of Florence's cathedral, was originally trained as a goldsmith and sculptor. Leon Battista Alberti only fully turned his attention to architecture after having first established himself as a writer and theorist on the nature of painting. Michelangelo, of course, was primarily known as a sculptor, who would occasionally paint when pressed, before becoming one of the most renowned architects of his age. And Donato Bramante, Raphael's influential predecessor as chief Vatican architect, began his career as a painter. But the point isn't simply that Raphael possessed the necessary technical qualifications of the time to become an architect. It's that architecture had consistently played a central role in Raphael's creative vision well before he actually found himself in charge of designing actual buildings. From his frequent architectural musings on preliminary sketches for commissioned paintings, to his detailed landscape scenes of buildings and cityscapes, to the uniquely powerful and innovative temple that enjoys such a prominent place in the Marriage of the Virgin. By the time he reached Rome, his architectural inclinations and convictions were on full display, both directly, in the School of Athens and the expulsion of Heliodorus, and indirectly, by creatively remodeling the rooms themselves to present the thematic ideas in the most spatially appealing way. Because for Raphael, perhaps more than any other artist before or since, architecture wasn't so much a separate activity in itself, but simply a natural component of producing the most coherent and integrated work of art imaginable. And nowhere is this attitude more vividly on display than in the second chapel he designed for Agostino Chigi in the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo. Like its counterpart we saw earlier in Santa Maria della Pace, it's a striking multimedia effort that combines Christian and classical iconography. But this chapel's most famous feature is not a fresco, but its remarkable Pantheon-like dome in gold mosaic above 4 symmetrical arches that seamlessly merge to once again present a continuous, unified space. That, and the riveting sculptures by Bernini that were created almost 150 years later. The chapel was uncompleted at Raphael's sudden death in 1520, a few days before Chigi's, as it happens, with the main altarpiece and other features later created by an assembly of others, culminating with Bernini's stunning work in the mid-17th century. But the overall layout, from the mesmerizing dome to the pyramid-shaped tombs, to 2 of the statues, one of Jonah and the whale and another of the prophet Elijah, explicitly reflect Raphael's vision of combining a wide range of different luxurious materials and artistic forms into one compelling whole. Which is not to say, of course, that Raphael didn't design and build entire buildings. He most certainly did. But one reason why his architectural skills are so frequently overlooked today is that many of those structures are no longer standing 500 years later. During his lifetime, however, his architectural reputation was quite different, as witnessed by his epitaph in the Pantheon, which explicitly states that he enhanced the glory of Popes Julius and Leo with his works in painting and architecture. Perhaps his first full architectural commission was also from the ever-present Chigi, not for his spectacular new villa, which was designed by Baldassare Peruzzi, who was also a wonderful painter, by the way, as any visitor to the Villa Farnesina can readily see, but its adjacent stables, now mostly destroyed, that were once sufficiently grand to hold sumptuous parties attended by Leo himself. Raphael was also, it appears, the first architect of the Roman church of Sant'Eligio degli Orefici, but the final result, completed well after his death, is quite different from his original plans. And then there are the palazzi, 2 in the Borgo area of Rome next to the Vatican where he was living, both of which, sadly, have been subsequently demolished, and 2 more that are still extant. one across the Tiber in the city's then financial district that he likely worked with Giulio Romano on, and a fourth one in Florence in collaboration with Giovanni Francesco da Sangallo, a Florentine-based architect who could supervise its construction. Meanwhile, he produced competition designs for two churches, San Giovanni dei Fiorentini in Rome and the facade for San Lorenzo in Florence, the main Medici church, neither one of which were accepted. San Lorenzo was awarded to Michelangelo, who never completed it. Raphael was also planning on moving from his luxurious home in the Borgo into an even larger complex of two adjoining townhouses on the other side of the Tiber that he'd personally designed to meet his own particular private and professional needs. But that, too, he never had a chance to build. Architecture, clearly, was in his blood, yet another overlapping aspect of his all-consuming creative drive. So it was hardly a surprise when he was appointed as the Vatican's chief architect in 1514 upon the death of Bramante, strongly recommended, we're told, by the dying Bramante himself. We saw earlier how Raphael was involved in coordinating several interior design projects in the Vatican, but it's certainly worth mentioning that he was also deeply involved in creating those spaces to begin with, carving out Cardinal Bibbiena's private apartment, while substantially modifying Leo's loggia from Bramante's original design of a straightforward imitation of the ancient Roman tabularium to a stunning series of archways and light that would perfectly resonate with his unique decorative program. Of course, by far his most significant responsibility as chief Vatican architect was that of the new St. Peter's Basilica, the most important church in all of Christendom, and, it seems, a correspondingly large architectural headache for Raphael. He spent a considerable amount of his customary energy on the project, replacing Bramante's plan of a circular-style Greek cross with a more traditional longitudinal one, but he hardly had the time to implement it. In the end, he became merely one of a long line of chief architects to wrestle with the challenge of the new St. Peter's complex over its 160-year construction odyssey. But the architectural effort that is widely viewed as his masterpiece was one that was never fully completed. The remarkable Villa Madama, named, just like Chigi's Villa Farnesina, after a later owner, this time Margaret of Austria, or Margaret of Parma, the illegitimate daughter of Charles V. Perched on the slopes of Monte Mario, less than 4 kilometers north of the Vatican, it was commissioned by Leo for his cousin Giulio, the future Pope Clement VII, and its primary purpose seems to have been that of a sort of luxurious overnight rest stop for distinguished visitors to recuperate from their travels before making their formal entry into Rome. While few clear plans for the villa and grounds remain, this is more than compensated for by the existence of a detailed letter from Raphael, walking us through the building as if it were finished, to describe its stunning, meticulously thought-out details, featuring 2 courtyards and an elaborate garden framed on its main axis, along with a separate private orange grove, 3 loggias, a hillside theater with dressing rooms for the actors and designed to ensure no direct sunlight during the usual late afternoon performance times, a hippodrome, extensive stables, elaborate basement bath system, and several specifically designed areas for relaxed, civilizing conversation, each one tailored to a particular time of year and temperature in keeping with the building's orientation and surroundings. The relatively small part of the structure that was actually built, remarkable enough in its own right to have made a strong impression on many over the centuries, gives us a palpable sense of what might have been, with its beautiful combination of half of the circular courtyard, summer loggia, now covered over by glass, gardens, fish pond, and more. The entire project was an emphatic testament to Raphael's passionate belief in the power of ancient Roman architecture. That he carefully outlined his ideas and motivations in a detailed letter is hardly a coincidence, emphatically mirroring, as it does, Pliny the Younger's famous letters describing his villas 1,500 years earlier, which explains why Raphael constantly invoked a stream of Latin terminology when proudly showcasing what his new palace had to offer. Because for Raphael, this project clearly represented the culmination of a dream. After years of being so strongly influenced by famous classical structures, he finally had the chance to create a contemporary one of his very own. Raphael's deep love of classical antiquity and artistic adoption of so many of its features clearly predate his 1508 move to Rome. So much so that some are convinced that a careful inspection of his paintings provides evidence for him having spent time in the city years earlier. Well, that's still an open question. But what can't be debated is that the classically obsessed world of early 16th century Rome was the perfect fit for a young Raphael determined to integrate antique principles into contemporary art. And a figure like Donato Bramante, an experienced and powerful force at the head of Julius's comprehensive architectural and urban planning program devoted to doing precisely that, was an obvious person to associate with, learn from, and be influenced by. But as we've seen repeatedly, from his father to Perugino, to Pinturicchio, to Fra Bartolomeo, to Leonardo, to Michelangelo, and many more besides, being influenced by is hardly the same as copying. And so it was with Bramante. Raphael surely learned a great deal from Julius's chief architect and fellow Urbino artist, whom he clearly deeply respected. As it happens, and surely not coincidentally, Raphael's luxurious home in the Borgo during his last years in Rome was the Palazzo Caprini, designed by none other than Bramante. But as usual, Raphael was in no way a mere disciple, as can be seen from two of his tapestry cartoons for the St. Paul cycle, Paul Preaching at Athens and The Sacrifice at Lystra. Both have architectural backgrounds that are clearly influenced by Bramante's celebrated Tempietto, a small commemorative structure in the courtyard of the Church of San Pietro in Montorio, commissioned by Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain to mark the believed location of St. Peter's crucifixion, and itself strongly influenced by ancient Roman structures. But both of Raphael's Tempietto-like buildings in his tapestry cartoons are significantly, if slightly, different from Bramante's. In Paul Preaching at Athens, the pillars are spaced differently, the upper level is altered and out of sight, and the ornate balustrade has been replaced by a simple wooden one. While in The Sacrifice at Lystra, the underlying structure is comprehensively transformed. Once again, the message is clear. It's not about repetition. It's about absorbing as much as possible from as many worthy directions as you can find, in order to create something best suited to the particular circumstances at hand. Nothing was sacrosanct, very much including, most significantly, the ancients themselves. Even Vitruvius, the classical architectural authority whose works Raphael had studied very carefully and was diligently preparing a first Italian edition of in collaboration with his humanist friend Fabio Calvo, was hardly off limits. Vitruvius's curmudgeonly lament, "We now have fresco paintings of monstrosities rather than truthful representations of definite things. How is it possible that a reed should really support a roof, or that such a slender, flexible thing as a stalk should support a figure perched upon it?" was met cheekily by Raphael and Giovanni da Udine, who regularly created intricate examples of vastly more fantastical imaginings than those that had so irritated Vitruvius. And then there's Raphael's famous sketch of the interior of the Pantheon, which contains an intriguing number of deviations from the way it actually looks. And while most experts maintain that he was working from a poor copy, or changes were made by a second author, or some other explanation, another much more straightforward possibility also exists, that he simply thought it looked better the way that he drew it. But before you break the rules, you have to know the rules, which not only meant rigorously studying the classical texts, but also carefully examining ancient works. Unfortunately, however, many of the new construction projects in Rome, including the new St. Peter's, were built by cannibalizing ancient monuments, leading to their destruction at an alarming rate. But Raphael was now in the perfect position to put a stop to things. Not only was he the chief architect responsible for the design and construction of St. Peter's, in the summer of 1515, Leo also put him in charge of all stone and marble to be used for its construction. The stage was set for embarking on one of his most ambitious projects of all, a rigorous cataloging and reconstruction of all ancient Roman monuments and sculptures. Which brings us to another of Raphael's famous letters. This one addressed directly to Leo and co-written with his humanist friend Baldassare Castiglione to provide the necessary literary polish. He begins by urging the Pope to officially stop the pernicious modern practice of dismantling ancient monuments to construct modern buildings, before moving on to give a sort of preliminary report of his personal observations of the city's ruins, since, as he intriguingly mentions, Leo had specifically tasked him with drawing as much of ancient Rome as can be known from what is still to be seen. His general conclusion is that of all the ancient arts, architecture declined the slowest and was the last to be lost, citing, as a revealing example, the 4th century Arch of Constantine that was built in a beautiful, well-executed architectural style, but whose contemporary reliefs were laughingly amateurish compared to the excellent cannibalized works on its upper levels that had been created centuries earlier. The rest of the letter is focused on best practices required to carry out this ambitious project, from an itemization of specific surveying techniques, which, among other things, particularly recommends the magnetic compass that Leonardo had used to create his map of Imola that we saw earlier, to a detailed description of the ideal preparatory architectural drawings, explicitly contrasting the needs and orientations of the architect with those of the painter. Many scholars believe that the letter was written to be a preface for the final document, but will likely never know for certain, since, like far too many of his later projects, he never had the chance to complete it. And while individual sketches of Roman ruins were naturally produced here and there, the first rigorous categorization of ancient Roman monuments only appeared several decades later with the work of the renowned architect and writer Andrea Palladio. It's often said that, of all the countless creative deprivations represented by Raphael's sudden early death, it was the loss of this uniquely comprehensive visual account of ancient Roman life that only he could have produced that most anguished his humanist friends.